On today's show, we're going to be talking about whether AI and design systems can play nicely together or whether this is all just hype. I am Luke Murphy, and I'm joined by my co-host Michelle Chin. We're both design advocates at Zeroheight, the design system management platform, and this is Design Systems WTF. Oh, AI! What a contentious topic. I'm curious, actually. Well, you mentioned before we started recording properly that you're maybe not as hyped about AI as me. So I just want to hear your thoughts on it because I don't think I've just talked at you about AI, Michelle. So I want to hear your thoughts on, yeah,
Yeah,
what's going on with
well, I mean, I think this gets into like more design systems existentially, but I mean, I love
it? Yeah.
AI and I love the potential that it has outside of design systems. Like I also am very aware of like the ethical, like I'm cautious, like optimistically cautious because like, I want to make sure that things are like ethical
Oh
and
yeah, it's
kosher. Yeah.
currently a shit show. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Which I saw some stuff that's like wild and crazy. But then when it comes to AI and design systems, I'm like, how much of that do we really need? And maybe I haven't been exposed to it enough, or there's not enough fed into the machine, right, for it to do really well with design systems. And maybe that's kind of the role that design system people can play is like, you know, feeding it content to then do the thing. But but that gets into the whole design system existential existence, I guess. I don't even know where to begin with that or where to unpack that. But if you have any
Yeah,
questions.
if you can summarize that in just, like 30 seconds, that'd be great. Your existential crisis when it comes to design systems.
Yeah, okay. So I think like for me as a designer, I'm like, how many times do we as designers need to design a button? Like it's got a label, maybe it has a border, maybe it has, like colors. Like we don't need to do too
Oh.
much, right? Like we can just go
Hmm.
with one button and then use like design tokens to theme it however we need
Yeah.
to. So we don't need IA to do that. Like we don't. It's simple, it's
AI.
straightforward. We just use the technology. We use the brains that we have, or even just one brain, because one person can do it, and we can just copy that person and theme it. Um,
Well,
so we don't need
yeah.
AI for
I,
that, right? So
so this is, I mean, because you've been talking about this a lot so Michelle has done a talk at a couple conferences now called Decolonizing Design, and one of the big parts of it is calling for building a global design system, which is, I know Brad Frost has also been talking about this as well, and it does make sense because when we're talking about design systems, like I'm gonna say something a hot take here. 90% of design systems look exactly the same. Like there's not it's not like there's not much difference between design systems that a theme layer would probably not cover off, or at least start like as a base for how we kick off design systems. So I do think that that's like a good thing. But until we have that, because there's, I don't know, anything that we want to create that is standardized and able to be used across the world is a task. There's a reason that W3C goes from like initial concept to first drafts within what, 5 years, and then accepted draft probably add in another 3 or 4 years. Until we have that concept alone actually makes me think that AI is a really great tool for creating it, because the fact that design systems are all very similar and we're all singing from very similar hymn sheets, to use a crappy analogy.
yeah, I didn't go to church.
Yeah, neither did I. That's fine. But we're all basing these off of very similar ideas. That means that if we're like querying like large language models to give us, especially things like documentation or variations or sort of small tasks within that design system sort of like creation process, um I don't see it as much of a problem, and it's probably going to be pretty accurate, right?
Yeah,
Ish.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. I mean, even even writing uh, prompts for or like having ChatGPT write your design system documentation, like it does an okay-ish job. It gets you like probably like
Yeah.
85% of the way there. But you obviously have to like monitor it to make sure it's, accurate to your design system. And
I'm just gonna share down there that Michelle, and we'll share this in the show notes as well. But Michelle actually wrote a good article about writing Chat GPT prompts for design systems, which is quite handy.
yeah, you can
It's
just
and actually we've got some more stuff coming up as well because we've been tinkering with it a little bit.
yeah, you can so there's a couple articles. I kind of talk through like how you can use ChatGPT, but there's also an article that actually has the prompts that you can just copy that I wrote that you can use for your design system, to make it really
Yeah,
easy. I think the big thing is like you still do have to monitor it because some of it is gonna it's gonna make up stuff that doesn't apply to your design system. It might also include
yeah,
extra stuff that you've already decided as part of your component. So maybe they'll say like about a button group, they'll be like, have a primary color and a secondary color, but like that's part of your component. So you can take out that usage guideline or that spec.
yeah.
But it is like 85% of the way there. So I think that's good. Um, I guess like, and I think like where AI could be really cool is like coming up with patterns. So like a lot of my talk is like thinking about design system patterns, not necessarily your components. And patterns are harder for us as humans to kind of identify in terms of like designing across UIs. Because I think a lot of times like we'll say like this one workflow for this one app about like a shopping cart is very specific to this one app, but you might have another shopping cart experience and workflow, and you're like, oh no, this is different because it's these different things. So it's kind of hard to suss out like what makes a good pattern, like a global pattern that can be used across your products. So maybe AI can help with that. Um,
Yeah.
like take some of that heavy lifting of like, oh, I've noticed you've done this. Like, what happens if you like unify some of this or take out some of this or what have you? Or I think that's where
So
AI could be cool.
I yeah, I think this is a really interesting area that I was actually looking to see if there are any tools out there that do this. So the concept of like predictive design analysis or predictive product analysis, which is, I mean, it's a part of what you're talking about there, right? So it's like if it's generated a pattern or you've made a pattern and you want it to tell you how to do it better, um, based off of the knowledge it has, because it's the whole concept of LLMs is they've got access to a lot of knowledge, and they should be able to make those patterns. And I was thinking, you know what, like that'd be really cool if somebody built it. And of course, somebody has built it. Like there are things out there that exist. So I was looking at Pendo, which I've heard of but never used before, which is like a suite of product tools, and they've got some interesting promises with their AI um, sort of suggestions. And I think that one of the ones that was an interesting one, which is it's actually almost a step before patterns, is improving your flows that you create. Knowing the steps that people take to do things, it can like suggest efficiencies. And I think that this is actually like, which is not far from analyzing a pattern or like a wire that explains a pattern, um, to basically use the knowledge it has to improve that. And I'm sure that if you feed in the right text to even into ChatGPT, it can probably do this already too, right? Um, I think part of the problem for me, though, is the fact that we just don't know where the data is. At the moment, at least, we don't know where a lot of this data comes from. Like GPT are pretty opaque, like OpenAI are pretty opaque with where it comes from, and the fact that they only recently like provided the details of how you can opt out of this stuff. And I think that the powerful models for the kind of work that we do day to day, especially when we're dealing like with with the work that we do within companies, is the ones that allow you to train it off your own data or like very specified sets of data. Um, and I don't know, the stuff that Kevin Coyle was talking about at Converge this year, with what they're doing over at Big Medium, where they're basically training it on a lot of the data that they have from the design systems they've worked on to query, and they're using it almost like as an internal knowledge base to query stuff, which I think is a really cool use case. Like that idea of just going, oh yeah, how do we do this again? And just being able to like, use a little chatbot form to query the existing knowledge that you have. I don't know. I think that's one where it's like that's powerful. Like writing documentation, cool. That is like next level because it's second brain stuff, which is actually like super valuable, I think, especially once like the bigger the organization you get. I'm going
Yeah.
off on a ramble now.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about like how, like, especially with a big organization or just like complicated UI designs and like all
Yeah.
the thinking and the thought process that you went through to write or come to those decisions, like that can, if you weren't in the room or if you didn't document it, like you're not going to know. But if there's a way to reference that, because I think that's the other thing is like, um, I will name drop again in this episode. In in the webinar that Dan Mall and I did a couple months ago, we talked about
Wait,
how
picking that up again. Wait.
yes, um, we talked about how patterns are like if you use your documentation to kind of do a little journaling on how you came to decisions around patterns, that's probably better and more useful to those who are looking for patterns for the similar approaches. So, um, say, you're creating like a step-by-step wizard for people to set something up, and you have done, you've done the due diligence of making those design decisions. And you're just like, if you post it on your design system documentation, like this is the pattern you have to use, it might be hard for others to kind of fit that into their product without knowing the context of why you made those decisions or how flexible things can be. So
Yeah,
rather than like dictating, just kind of telling that story so they can figure out, um, where, like, how they can make the decisions to use the pattern that best suits their needs. So I think that, yeah, documenting and then having like AI to be like, hey, remember this, or we're choosing not to do this because of X, Y, and Z. It will make life easier because I think we do have to remember a lot these days.
but this is actually one of the things that I'm really excited about as well. And I think that like that's always going to have value, especially if you can put the time aside to journal down decision trees, whatnot. Um, however, sometimes a lot of that can be like you don't necessarily need to be that explicit if you have the right information present. So I know that like one of the things, I don't know, it's one of the things that was always seen as like a gold standard is to have all the UX research associated with a particular component in the documentation, so it's sort of accessed there. I will be frank with you and say that that is a very rare thing to see in anybody's design system documentation these days. Like people just don't have the time to do it because usually a large part of it is that their UX research sits in one place and their documentation sits in another, and they're two separate teams, and so and it's like there'll be a bit of a duplication of effort, and so it's one of those things where best intentions are great, but the reality is usually folks have it's very low on their priority list to like make things as good as possible. This is where like I think AI can be really powerful, and it's something that we've used a lot internally in different ways, actually, not necessarily design systems, but we use it a lot with the advocates, where we get OpenAI to it's repurposing content, right? If you collect all your UX research in say Airtable and that's tagged correctly, hook that up to Zapier, run that through OpenAI, get that piped directly into a webhook or something to pump into your documentation. I think it's like one of those things, or at least, export it into like a Slack message that you can then easily copy and paste whenever anything is, related to a component or whatever. I think there's some really interesting ways that we can like automate the delivery of information across stuff whilst our systems don't automatically do it for us. Because that's the other thing is I think that this is going to be standard in a lot of tools soon, where you can just like connect up all your stuff. I noticed like Grammarly have started doing this, right? Where they've got beta tests now where they're automatically connecting up to a lot of tools so that it's has context of what you're doing in other tools that it can then like help you with. um yeah, so it's like, I mean, yeah, journaling is always good, but hey, if we can remove the need, the time that is required
Well,
to
yeah,
do
I
that
mean,
and
and that's the
automate
thing,
it.
like you can, and journaling can be like recording the meeting and then having the
Yeah.
transcript generated through AI and then highlights pulled out and documented or fed through a database. And then there was like this, like, I forgot what it was, like, a research method of like using Airtable and taking like little snippets of findings into a database.
Yeah.
Something about chicken nuggets. I can't remember the method, but maybe someone remembers, and we'll add that in the show notes. But like, yeah, it's just if we can just get all the data that's like specific to like our orgs and just get it like processed through AI where it gets us to like 85% of the answers we need, I think that's a huge win
Mm.
rather than having to parse through everything, remember everything. I think it's just a matter of getting that data in and us and people feeling good about it too, right? Like they want a closed system. People don't want to put all their information out into the ether for AI to process. So
Yeah, which yeah, I don't know. I'm in two minds about. It's this is where we get into the ethical and moral quandaries of AI. I think that everybody should have a right to opt out. I don't necessarily think like it's not like it's going to recreate your stuff verbatim, although that has happened. So um but I don't know. I think that sometimes people are maybe a little bit um uh precious. But
shall
hey,
we?
that's just my opinion, and I shouldn't delve too much into opinions. I just want to say actually that one other cool use case before we jump into the questions because they're
Yeah.
starting to come through, which is great. Um, there was one other use case that I was like, oh, actually, it's not one that we've done. It's actually again something that we have done, but for different purposes. Um, is I know one of the things that people often don't get time to do is like community content or you know, documentation around like communicating about your system and explaining things to do with your system, where to find things or whatever. Basically, it's kind of like creating product documentation and help guides. And it was one of those things where I'm like, why aren't we using tools like Scribe to help us in the creation of like design system documentation specific guides? Um, because the whole concept with that is you just basically do a quick like Loom video and it documents all the steps out for you straight away. So when you're doing you know, when you're explaining a new version or a new feature of your design system, like do this and then have it the content be accessible in like multiple ways. I don't know, it's just one of those things where I'm like, it's again, it's just using AI so that you can cover as many bases as possible and be efficient as possible with your time, which I think is like, I don't know, pretty exciting concept. But you're right, we do need to get to the questions. So, so going through them now. Oh, I don't know if you have a suggestion for this. There's a great question from Angelina here around whether there are any good tool suggestions for helping automate token naming.
Um,
Um, have you played with
I
this yet?
No, but I want to. So that's like on my to-do list once I got back from all the conferences and all the other things. But I am looking at that because I think that's a lot of what teams struggle with. Um,
Yeah,
so yeah, I think I figured, but in order to kind of create that tool, it's like you have to really get like a good solid foundation on like design tokens and yeah, like
yeah.
taxonomy and all this other stuff. So it's like, yeah, it would be really great, but like it just takes a little bit of time. But maybe hopefully soon. I'm thinking
It's
winter
creating
project.
Yeah, it's creating a naming framework, right? And I think that's like which I know that you are currently working on. But there are, I mean, if you Google out their token naming framework, and I know that this is something that people do, is you can basically, if you get the top level rules to your token naming framework, chuck it in ChatGPT, and the output is surprisingly good. I know there's also a bunch of Figma plugins out there. So if anybody has any suggestions, please chuck them in the chat. for any that you've used. It's just that I haven't used this. And yeah, Robert's right. Is in the chat saying that Sil was talking about this. So Sil has used ChatGPT to create this. And of course, the first thing I did when I got off the webinar was go and have another play with it, because I know the last time I did it, it was rubbish. And this time, giving it more structure and more context helped. So
Yeah.
I'll pull together the prompt that I was creating, because of course I did,
I think that's the thing
didn't
is
think
like,
to
and you brought
prepare
this up
that.
in the, I think, sorry, I'm like talking over you. So I think you brought this up in the webinar yesterday, which is like prompt, like crafting your prompt is like a whole different skill
Yeah.
set that like is something that,
Mm.
you can kind of like craft and hone in on to get those answers. So, um, yeah, I think it's like if you're not getting the right answers or the answers that you're kind of expecting, like just try tweaking your prompt until you get it, but also like kind of keep an eye on like what you've said to make those to get ChatGPT to respond a little bit closer.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So Lindsay also has asked if you could share an example of the journaling and where that's been documented within design systems.
Yeah, I don't have a physical example, but I can like so the way it would work is like if you were creating like a dashboard, as you're designing the dashboard, you're making design decisions and just kind of logging that as you go of like, oh, we wanted to make it only 4 columns wide because of this reason. Um, and just like, just kind of taking notes of some of the decisions that you're making, even the ones of like, oh, we decided to not go with 4 columns or what have you. Um, and just kind of getting the flow. It's a little messy, but and a little it could get a little long, but at least people who might need to use a dashboard pattern in the future can kind of get to where your thought process was. But that's kind of like where AI would come in handy, where it kind of parse through and just say like, hey, if you're making a dashboard, consider these things. Um, and kind of keep you in check. Kind of how someone was mentioning, I think Roland was mentioning earlier about how they use AI to kind of make sure they're not missing any requirements or anything, which is great because I think
Yeah,
the thing is like, you know, there's a lot of times where even though we do know what we're doing, we can forget things, and it's always a good gut check. I think the thing is like you also have to know enough to know whether ChatGPT is being like honest or accurate, because sometimes they can have these AI hallucinations where they're just kind of like making up answers. But as long as you know, like that's not what's real and what's not real, it's a good way to gut check your work.
yeah, definitely, definitely. By the way, I love the fact that we call them hallucinations when in fact it's just lying. But anyway, I do think that, and basically, like a lot of what you're talking about, it's decision logging, right? Like that's um the other way to frame it. So I know that there's a lot of ways that you can do that, and if you do a quick Google search on decision logs, you can see some of the different techniques. But basically, think about including it as like a change log at the bottom of key components or anything where there have been key decisions made in your documentation. I don't think you need separate tools to do it or anything, right?
No, I would say like stay in the tools that you have. No need to add another tool to your arsenal, and then keep it simple. I think some of those decision tree things get into like tables and all this stuff, but like anything that becomes cumbersome to use, people aren't going to use it. So, and just
Yeah,
try it once,
yeah,
see how it goes, how well it resonates with your team.
yeah.
Um,
I think that is one of the things that I have noticed, especially when it comes to AI, is that people are like there are a breed of folks who are a little bit closed off to the concept of using it, and I think it's a shame because I think that there are some um, really great potential. Oh, there is a very good question. We've only got 2 minutes left, so let's see if we can do it. And apologies, we'll try and answer all the other questions in Slack, if you want to come in there. Um, how concerned are you that dependency on AI could potentially stifle creativity and innovation in design processes? Do you have opinions? Because I do.
I'm I'm not that concerned. I think there is going to be some people, especially like I think kids today, right? Like they're gonna like grow up with AI and then maybe become really dependent on AI. But I think at the same time, like that's only going to get them so far in life. Like they're still gonna
Yeah.
have to have critical thinking skills. And I think, I mean, I could totally be wrong, because like maybe in 2 months, like AI develops critical thinking and we are all screwed. But the idea is that we would still need humans to do like that innovation and that
Yes.
critical thinking, where AI is just like a tool to get us there faster almost.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is one of the big things that we have shown is that like creatively speaking, generative AI is pretty rubbish. Like it's not it's very hard to get good generative AI output without good creative input. So it's like it's the output is only as good as the input. And I think that that's what we're I was talking about this yesterday, where I feel like a lot of people are going to be pushed into a bell curve in terms of into the middle. And I think that there's a lot of copy and paste folks who are just going to be very average, and everything they output because they're using AI is going to be very generic. Whereas it's going to like push the outliers further up, and that like creativity and that ability to critically think is going to become even more of a commodity and very important. I think that the and this is, I think this can be seen like to have a proper example, like the amount that you need to prompt engineer to get good output out of something like ChatGPT shows that you still need to have the ideas. You still need to be able to push stuff in there. And similar, if you're using like video or audio image generative AI like Midjourney or whatnot, as somebody who's been playing with this a lot, it takes to get good output consistently takes about as much time as it does to create the thing. So I think that all this is doing, so it's like I don't think that we need to be worried about like this putting folks out of jobs. What it's doing is it's democratizing a lot. It's making it more accessible to more people, as long as the actual tools themselves are accessible,
Yeah.
and not ridiculously expensive. Which at the moment, like we should have more free tools, basically, but or more access to tools. But I do think that we are democratizing access to things like design and video, audio, text, like creative text, code. All of these things are basically, it's making the barrier to entry a little bit lower, which I think is always a good thing. And as long as we move towards that ideal of then how much folks get paid for those jobs and whatnot doesn't go down, as long as we form a union. I'm not allowed to get onto that again. I think we should be fine. We're already 2 minutes over, so I think we should probably nip it
Yeah,
in
we
the
should
bud there.
wrap up.
And keep the conversation going on the Zeros Slack community. Thank you so much for joining us. That's it for today. If you have any questions or want to fire across to us or get us fired for the next episode,
I
please
need my
send
job.
them through. Send them through either via the Zeros Slack community, which you can reach at zeroheight.com/Slack, on X at zeroheight, or you can email us at community@zeroheight.com. Until then, see you next time.